I am so pleased to welcome you today to Speech Limits in Public Life at the intersection of free speech and hate. As we talked about last night, for those who weren't here, really what today is about is trying to talk about and discuss ways that we can balance the intersection of these two things so that we have ways that we can respond to hate speech without impinging on freedom of expression. So really trying to find solutions. And unfortunately, last night again, we're reminded the importance of this discussion as there were at least 49 people killed in mosques in New Zealand. And it very much appears to be a hate crime. So the urgency of this discussion is made real to us again last night. I would like very much to welcome Nadine Strossen and John Powell, who will be giving our opening. And I want to tell you just a little bit about them. Actually, one thing I wanted to say before that was I wanted to welcome, there are over 20 high school students in the room today, and I wanted to welcome you especially because we are very happy to have you here and to be a part of this discussion. So thank you for coming, and thank you to your chaperones who brought you. All right, so Nadine Strossen is the John Marshall Harlan II Professor of Law at New York Law School. She has written, taught, and advocated extensively in the areas of constitutional law and civil liberties, including through frequent media interviews. From 1991 through 2008, she served as president of the American Civil Liberties Union, the first woman to head the nation's largest and oldest civil liberties organization. Professor Strossen is currently a member of the ACLU's National Advisory Council, as well as the advisory boards of the Electronic Privacy Information Center, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, and Heterodox Academy. And the last two of those are represented here today on our panels as well. When she stepped down as ACLU president in 2008, and I think this speaks to her bipartisan support, 3 Supreme Court justices attended, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Antonin Scalia, and David Souter. Her book, Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, was published by Oxford University Press last year. And also, those books are for sale. There's another room here that we've got off to the left. All of the panelists and speakers who have books, their books are for sale in that room. And there's also, we had a student competition audio essay, and there's listening stations to be able to hear that during lunch or during breaks, if you want to do that. All right, and then John Powell, who we are very happy to welcome, is director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society and professor of law, African American and ethnic studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He was previously the executive director, and I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce this right, at the Kirwan Center, or Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at Ohio State University, and the Institute for Race and Poverty at the University of Minnesota. Prior to that, John was the National Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union. He is a co-founder of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council and serves on the boards of several national and international organizations. John led the development of an opportunity-based model that connects affordable housing to education, health, healthcare, and employment, and is well known for his work developing the frameworks of targeted universalism and othering and belonging to effect equity-based interventions. John has taught at numerous law schools, including Harvard and Columbia University, and his latest book is Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Concepts of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society, also on sale in the other room today. So I want to welcome them. I had asked them to do a debate about the tension between free speech and hate speech and whether there should be additional laws for that, and they responded to me that they would prefer to have a discussion. So they will be having a discussion about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, for that wonderful introduction, and thank the audience for your gracious welcome. And most of all, thanks to my longtime friend and colleague, John, for being able to fit this into his very crowded, wonderful schedule. The reason why John and I decided that this should be a discussion rather than a debate is I'm not actually sure what, if anything, we disagree about on this topic. But let me start by outlining the ACLU position, which John and I were both there at the time that it was last examined and formulated. And then after I outline it, maybe I'd love to hear John's comments about it. So as is famously known, the ACLU throughout its history, but most controversially in 1977 in a case called the Skokie case, came to the defense of free speech rights for neo-Nazis. We had always defended all fundamental freedoms for all people, including people whose ideas are antithetical to our own civil libertarian values. And the ACLU has existed for, we'll be celebrating our 100th birthday next year, so this went back a long time. In 1977 to 78, that longstanding position was put to a very severe test when the people who were exercising their freedom and calling upon the ACLU to defend it were neo-Nazis who were demonstrating deliberately in a town that had not only a large Jewish population, but many Holocaust survivors. And that was such a controversial position, not in the courts of law, where it was an easy case. Oh no, we would say it was hard and our lawyers did a brilliant job, but quite frankly, that involved what the Supreme Court has called the bedrock principle of free speech, that government has to remain neutral with respect to the content or the message of the speech. But it was severely controversial in the court of public opinion, including within the ACLU itself. So today people say, oh, it's so controversial. There are debates within the ACLU about whether we should have defended free speech for the white supremacists in Charlottesville. Back in 1977, we lost 15% of our members. So this is a very controversial position, even among die-hard, card-carrying civil libertarians. Roll the clock forward, about 10 years later, there is, for the first time, serious scholarship that all by law professors, all by minority law professors, including a very good friend of John's, Charles Lawrence, who was gracious enough to come to an ACLU conference to talk about this, making new arguments about, because the concern traditionally, and in the Skokie case, had been about potential violence. But Chuck and Mari Matsuda and Richard Delgado marshaled evidence that was very disturbing about the psychological and emotional adverse impact, a speech suppressive impact that was really undermining equality of opportunity for minority students who had traditionally been excluded from colleges and universities. And they said, look, it's not enough to just let down the formal barriers to entry if people are going to be subject to hate speech. So they advocated hate speech codes, and I'm very proud that the ACLU, without hesitation, said, let's re-examine our traditional position. So, and John, you were there during that debate, and I know you've carried forward with a very important scholarship about the actual harm from hateful speech.
So first of all, it's great to be here with Nadine. As you can tell, we're friends and have known each other a long time. And both of us, I think, have really deep affection and also recognize the importance of these issues, but also the ACLU. Let me start by just saying why not a debate, and then say a little bit about some of my thinking on some of these issues. So I'm 6 of 9. It doesn't mean I'm a Bork, if those of you who follow Star Trek. It means there are 9 children in my family. I'm number 6. And I have a great family. It's a very loving family. My father is still alive. He's 98, creeping up on 99, and getting stronger all the time. My mom passed some years ago. And several years ago, I was in Detroit, where my father lives, and we were wrestling with something. Actually, I think it was the issue of, it may have been gay marriage. And my father, from his Christian perspective, was adamantly opposed. And so we stayed up all night discussing it. And what occurred to me in that process is that it wasn't a debate, it was an inquiry. And we really were searching not just for quote unquote the truth, whatever that might be, but really to understand each other. And it occurred to me that in many ways in the United States, debates are actually like sporting events.
Yes.
It's like, and you score, you score a point, and the other teams, yes, that was good. That was usually zinged her, or he really zinged him. And so you walk away, someone having won and someone having lost. But oftentimes, as they say, not much light really being shed on things. And we just felt like, in many important issues, it may not be as much fun to have a serious inquiry, but oftentimes it's much better. This is especially true, I think, in these times in our country, where the country is so deeply divided, by some accounts more divided than even during the Civil War. So that's sort of the background. After that conversation with my dad, and like Nadine, but not as often, I'm on the circuit as well, so I get these calls and they say, do you want to come debate so-and-so? And I say, no, I'm not doing any debates. So for a couple of years, I took myself largely off the circuit doing debates because I felt like the format was problematic. So I think these issues are really complicated, and as Nadine said, the people she cited are all friends of mine. And I think what they brought to the attention, I think is still coming out. And I think the sort of thinking about free speech, or what's called hate speech, will continue. And I think, and it should. If you think about the formulation of the importance of speech, first of all, it's a complicated set of concepts. It's not one concept, it's actually many concepts. And these concepts themselves are sometimes in conflict with each other. And what we do oftentimes is sort of approach things almost as a slogan, or in terms of a term, like the famous marketplace of ideas. I teach at Berkeley, and when my students say markets, words like markets, capitalism, socialism, actually don't let them use those terms without really digging into what they mean. Because they actually just become props for almost an emotional response. And there's not a single definition. Each one of those things means several different things, which has importance as we discuss things. I think this is equally true when we talk about free speech. Even the idea of speech. We probably don't even have complete agreement, I'm not saying we should, in terms of what constitutes speech. So we just saw one of the most controversial cases, Citizens United. Is money speech or not speech, or is money spent? And on this issue, both the courts and the ACLU has shifted over time, and they're not done. So these are not simple questions. And so referring to the First Amendment doesn't resolve those questions for us. It just sort of ponies it up, if you will. So that's one thing. I think that we're dealing with complex concepts, and we're also making certain assumptions as we deal with those concepts. The last thing I'll say on this right now is that I think the new literature, which is, in my mind, the most important and interesting in some ways, is the stuff, and Nadine touches on some of this, I think, in her book and other places, it's the mind science in terms of how we understand injury. For much of the 20th century, we understood psychological and emotional injuries as over here and physical injuries over here. And a lot of people citing Mills would actually talk about why being offended or being annoyed or being bothered by speech, or what's called, some people call speech acts, was fundamentally different than physical touching. And so you had that old adage, my freedom stops at the tip of your nose, that I can, that I'm free to do anything, but I'm not free to physically interfere with you. And they were building upon Mill's concept of other-regarding and self-regarding acts. And I won't go into any detail on that now. But the point is that that line has actually been blurred in some serious ways. And so now, and this is just science, doesn't tell us how to resolve the debate or discussion, but it tells us we have to think about it differently. But we now know that the line between what we call psychological factors, including psychological injuries and physical, is actually essentially gone. That literally when you have a serious psychological trauma or whatever, it restructures physically restructures the brain and has serious implications in terms of the body. Now, and when I say that, people say, so then should we regulate speech? I say, no, it doesn't tell you what to do. It just tells you there's new data. And we have to actually think about the new data. Think about DNA. You know, there are people literally getting out of prison today because the best evidence we had, including eyewitness or whatever, was that this person did the crime. And then years later, we're digging up DNA and it said, nope, wrong. And how could we get this wrong? 3 people saw it, 3 people swore that this happened. And so what's happened is that our understanding of science has changed the way we think about evidence. And I'm suggesting that the science in terms of the mind and the body requires to sort of re-examine in a deeper way what kind of injuries we want to allow and what kind of injuries we don't want to allow. And I'll just end by just saying, and the injuries all over the place. So part of the assertion, appropriately so, is that to overly regulate speech, and some of you may know the book, Don't Think of the Elephant. Anyone of you know that book? George Lakoff, who's a linguist, and I know they have at least one linguist, I think, in the audience. He talks about we think in metaphors, but he also makes the notion that we should not say regulation. Because he says regulations mean safety, that we do things to create safety. We call it regulations. We've already biased how we're thinking about it. So should we regulate the environment? Should we regulate corporations? We're doing something to, sometimes inappropriately, sometimes appropriately, but we're doing something to create a safe environment. We're not just creating rules. But anyway, the point is that how we then create society, how we then have people in society, how we then have robust discussion, how we then have people being challenged, is all these questions need to actually be addressed in the context of what we're learning in terms of neuroscience today.
And I'm not going to at all dissent from what John has said, but I'm going to amplify on it, because just as it's really important to keep investigating the potential harm of hateful speech and any other speech, and I do emphasize potential, because I think there is a difference between the kind of harm that expression can cause and that the proverbial sticks and stones can cause, because they will immediately, simply by force of being thrown, the sticks and stones will directly harm you, whereas speech harm does involve some intermediating thought processes. And I want to go beyond what the potential, and in many cases actual harm is, to so what do we do about that? And I know that that's a big, big focus of John's work as well as my work. But let me take you back to the ACLU debate in the last generation, and then I'll bring it up to date in the current generation. We had a very distinguished, thoughtful committee of the ACLU's National Board of Directors examine this evidence. They were very persuaded of the potential harmful impacts, including undermining equality and dignity, inclusivity, diversity, societal harmony, individual mental well-being. These are definitely at least potential harms. I would also add a speech suppressive harm, because if you are subject to disparaging, hateful speech, or believe you will, it has a chilling effect on your speech. I personally have experienced it, not, I'm sure, to the extent that many other people have. So we took those very seriously, but then the question was, so what do you do about it? And after serious examination, the committee concluded that despite the good intentions of censoring some of this expression, that it would be ineffective at best and counterproductive at worst. And the committee did not stop there, as it should not have. It went on to list about a dozen constructive, non-censorial approaches that should be taken by universities in particular. We were focusing on the campus issue that would prevent and remediate potential harms from hate speech. And I'm very happy that some of these recommendations of 1991, so decades ago, some of the recommendations have been implemented, but too many of them have not yet. So I was very distressed when the Black Lives Matter movement started on campus and students started issuing requests or demands, that so many of them were the very same demands or requests that the ACLU had advocated all those decades ago. And we have not made enough progress in terms of really diversifying our campuses at every level and in improving the curriculum and improving people's ability to teach various groups of students who had traditionally been excluded from or marginalized at universities. Where we have made progress, and I'm really happy about this, is in what lawyers often call counter speech. When somebody issues disparaging, hateful expression, that it has to be swiftly and strongly responded to, the message denounced. I think maybe the speaker not necessarily denounced. We can talk about what's effective there. And, you know, I was really struck when I went back and reread Chuck's piece and Mari's and Richard Delgado's that several decades ago they said that in addition to the harmful impact of the hate speech itself from the hate monger, even worse was the fact that there was no response from the community. Number one, that media didn't give attention to these issues. If there was any coverage at all, it was very isolated. Nobody treated it as part of an overall societal problem. That there wasn't any denunciation of the message or distancing the university from it by the president of the university, by student body leaders, and there weren't any messages of support, or not enough messages of support for the disparaged people from other members of the community. Here, I think we have made enormous strides. I mean, you look at Charlottesville, and Donald Trump was so strongly denounced because he did not severely and fairly condemn the hate mongers there, right? But everybody else had very, very strong messages condemning the white supremacists in Charlottesville, including many Republican leaders who usually are completely in Trump's camp, and it was very unusual for them to be critical of him. Military leaders from every single branch of the military did likewise, and Trump had two councils of CEOs of businesses who were very supportive of his economic policies, his financial policies, but they spoke up and said, even more important than those policies is countering hatred and division. And ultimately, both of those councils were completely disbanded because they were so furious and disappointed about Trump's failure to exercise his counter speech. And at the grassroots level, communities all over the country spontaneously condemned the hatred and came together. I'm speaking from my own little town in Connecticut. We're unfortunate to have a weekend house, which is a mostly white town. But that's kind of interesting too, because that didn't matter. This is seen as a universal problem. It doesn't matter. You don't have to be part of the targeted group to feel as concerned. We have an ongoing interfaith, including secular people, committed to hate does not live here. I want to say, just move it up forward, and then I'd love to hear John talk about his amazing work. It had been about 20 years since I had looked at the research seriously about how effective is it to censor hate speech. We had now in the intervening 20 years, many countries all over the world with track records of enforcing these laws. And I do have to say, on an extremely sad note, New Zealand is an example of a country that not only has very strict anti-hate speech laws, including against Islamophobia and other religious hate speech, but those laws are very strictly enforced. And what I found as I looked at the record of European countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Latin America, there's data from all these countries, and over and over and over again, I'm hearing, and I quote them in my book, human rights activists in those countries are saying we ought to move more in the direction of counter speech, non-sensorial measures, because unfortunately we still have so much rampant not only hate speech but hateful conduct, discriminatory conduct, and hateful violent crimes. So strictly from the perspective of what is a more effective countermeasure, there is increasing support for non-sensorial approaches. And John, I have to say, when I started writing my book, I really thought it was going to be predominantly an anti-censorship book. And in the writing process and in the process of observing what was going on in this country and around the world, it really became very much more of an anti-hate book. And I think it's not a coincidence that the only verb in the title of my book is resist. I was thinking, so how do we resist hate, and what's the most effective way to do it? You're such a gentle person, you might prefer a more gentle verb than resist.
So I think the work that the committee did, and I know some of the people involved, I think was really quite appropriate. I think what I want to suggest is joining the conversation at a slightly different point. Because what I'm focusing on in many ways is not the potential injury, it's the actual injury. And I want to suggest that where there's an actual injury, and I had a chance to read your book, and I loved it. You talk about resiliency, but some injuries, and this is not something that the committee really engaged in, because the committee, as smart as they were, and really smart people, they're not neuroscientists. So again, a concrete example. There's certain traumas that are immediate, and they're more long-lasting than sticks and stones. Telomeres, which is the stems on your cells, and it actually allows your cells to absorb nutrients so that they continue to grow and reproduce. There's a lot of work, and this is some of it by David Williams at Harvard, showing that blacks in general, and black women in particular, the telomeres on their brains are shortened because of the constant tension, stress of racism in the United States. Now, this is a physical, and what it means is a shorter life expectancy. So it's not a potential. I mean, we can measure it. So I'm talking about, as we have science that says, and we know this in some sense, right? So virtually every state has laws in terms of anti-bullying and sort of a sex revenge, putting stuff on the web.
Revenge porn.
Yeah, exactly. Or think about the Me Too movement, or think about defamation, or think about, so there are places where there is no effective response by speech. And there's a real injury. And so, in that sense, I don't focus on hate speech, I focus on injurious speech. And I'm saying, well, if we, as a thought experiment, and I'm not saying we're there yet, but I think we're getting there. I think the science is only going to get better and better. I don't wear watches, but I'm wearing an Apple Watch. And I'll just tell you a brief story about this, and it makes sense to you. I have a sister. I'm 6 of 9, and I'm old. So it means I have a lot of old brothers and sisters. I mean, really old, in their 80s, right? And my sister's having a lot of health problems. And I was reading about the new Apple Watch coming out. And this is not an advertisement for Apple. I have no stock in Apple. But I did read that they were putting a medical electrocardiogram on the watch so that you could actually take the electrical impulse of your heart. And next year, they're planning on doing the same thing in terms of the brain. Now, here's just the crude science. You almost never just have a heart attack. Your body actually sends signals way before you have a heart attack, but they don't get to the conscious. You're unconscious. So if you're in a doctor's office and they had you hooked up, they would know a heart attack is on the way, long before you would. And so this watch, at least in some instances, will actually monitor the body. You can monitor the body and say, I feel fine. And the watch says, you're not fine. I said, no, I feel fine. I said, no, you're not fine. You're on your way to a heart attack. And there's actually been a story where a guy was wearing his watch at night, and they have a little thing on, they have sensors on it, so they wake you up. And the sensor woke him up saying, basically, you're having a heart attack. And he said he thought he was fine. He put his watch on his wife because he said the watch must be malfunctioning. It was not malfunctioning. He went to the hospital. He indeed was having a heart attack. My point is that the physical response was happening way before the mental recognition of it. And that's why I'm wearing this watch. And the watch is sort of, anyway. It also has a thing which is, if you fall and you don't get up in 30 seconds, the watch will actually say, I see that you have failed, are you okay? And if you don't respond within a certain period of time, it sends a message to the emergency to come get you, or whoever else. Anyway, my point is this. The science is getting to a point where we actually can measure injuries at a much deeper level. Some of those injuries are mercurial. They'll, I'm stressed today and my body tights up, but then I relax. Some of them are not. Yeah. Some of them are ongoing. And I'm suggesting that some of the things that we associate with hate speech, and I'm not suggesting that we regulate speech, but I do go back to Mill's concept of self-regarding and other regarding acts. His idea was that self-regarding acts, no one should have, you have a complete right to do whatever only regards yourself. But what impacts others, so if I do something to impact you and hurt you, then that's not a self-regarding act, that's the other regarding act. It doesn't say I can't do it. It says I don't have a right to do it. Then we have to say society has to decide whether or not I have that right. An example, most of us drive gasoline cars. Most of us believe, not everyone, but most people believe now that gasoline cars contribute to climate change, that we're hurting the environment. But we don't say gasoline cars are illegal. We say there's a cost of regulating or stopping gasoline cars. There's a cost to driving gasoline cars. We're going to make a social decision as to how we will distribute that. And I think that as we get better at understanding how some things are related to speech actually cause injury, not potential, actual injury, we need to have a conversation, and we might say, we're going to allow this because the injury of trying to stop it is even greater. But that's to be a collective discussion. It shouldn't be simply a right.
I thank John so much, and I did try to dip into the neuroscience research because I want as much information as possible. And I was convinced that there is a serious debate, even among neuroscientists, that absolutely must be continued, and we should be aware of it. But as John says, that's only part of the equation. And just as I think too often in the past civil libertarians would say free speech, end of discussion, I've seen people who have a different perspective, and notice I'm avoiding the locution other side because I think that is reductive and oversimplified and insulting, but people who have a different emphasis, shall we say, have too often said there's harm and that's the end of the debate, therefore there should be censorship or regulation. And that is an important part of the equation, but as John indicates, we also have to ask, what can we do about it? What can we do to prevent that actual or potential harm? What can we do to remediate it? And are certain interventions going to have negative consequences? As a civil libertarian, I should say, I'm always very nervous about empowering government. There's an inherent distrust there. There is a pattern over time where government has used seemingly benevolent power, including power to protect people from harmful or injurious speech, as a pretext for suppressing ideas that are critical of the government. So one pattern throughout history and around the world that I again saw as I did the research for my book, and human rights activists, including in international organizations, are complaining about, is that these laws being inherently vague and therefore vesting enormous discretionary power in the officials who enforce them, lend themselves to be enforced disproportionately against not only dissidents and critics of the government, but sadly and most ironically against members of the very minority groups who are most disparaged by hate speech and therefore supposedly have the most to gain from these laws. In this country, I met some of the high school students, and a special welcome to the youngest members of our audience. And let me just say, it's the 50th anniversary this year of a great ACLU landmark case, Tinker versus Des Moines School District, which, as you know, the court for the very first time held that freedom of speech does not stop at the schoolhouse gate. So I was talking to some of these students about a discourse about hateful speech, and I was very pleasantly surprised to hear from them that they do feel comfortable exchanging ideas, and that can do on sensitive subjects that too often, because of the fear not only of hate speech laws, but of censorious comments by your peers, might well be self-suppressed because you're afraid of being called an ist or an O. Anyway, they told me that, among other things, they had studied the Black Lives Matter movement, and as John well knows, Black Lives Matter speakers have been attacked in this country as supposedly engaging in hate speech. Government officials have sought to have Black Lives Matter condemned as a hate group. They've lobbied the Southern Poverty Law Center to have it labeled as such, and Black Lives Matter activists even have been accused of instigating assassinations of police officers in Dallas. And I think that would be what we could predict, including from the past, when Martin Luther King and other civil rights demonstrators were constantly silenced as a result of laws against speech that was deemed to be harmful in various ways. One other example, since I mentioned the famous Skokie case, when the ACLU came to the defense of the freedom of speech of neo-Nazis in Skokie, and there were allegations in that case by some briefs that there would be there would be emotional and psychic harm, that the speech was subversive, that the speech was dangerous, that it might trigger violence, the whole panoply of rationales. We pointed out in our brief that those were the very same arguments that had been made about 10 years earlier in another town in Illinois with very different demographics, namely Cicero, Illinois, which was very deeply segregated, predominantly white, and virulently opposed to the civil rights movement, and raised those arguments in an attempt to keep the Martin Luther King movement out of those streets. So for all of those reasons, I continued to reject censorship. And by the way, I put that in the past tense, and I want to share with you a question that I heard last week when I spoke at Skidmore College. The president of the college told me that he's writing a book, and he gave me permission to quote the title of the book because I think the title is so amazing. It is, "What Would It Take to Change Your Mind?" What would it take to change your mind? And the way that question is phrased, you have to assume, if you're an open-minded person, that something could change your mind. And I have to say quite candidly that if I were convinced that a particular kind of regulation would be necessary in order to foster equality and dignity and diversity and all of those wonderful goals, that would change my mind. So far, I haven't seen that evidence, though.
So let me just add one other thing. I'm very much enjoying this conversation. 15 years ago, about 20% of the world was living under authoritarian governments, China being the largest. Today, it's close to 60%. So one thing I'm going to ask, and you don't have to answer this today, Nadine, but I think we have to be very careful of disparaging government. yes, we have to have checks and balances, and yes, government overreach, and yes, government does a lot of things, but I think in a sense we've gone too far. And our skepticism of government has actually been weaponized. And that in some ways, I would say the single biggest threat in the world today, from my perspective, is not suppression of speech, it's not equality per se, it's authoritarianship. And I think that we unwittingly sort of step into that by being, I tell my students, you need to be critical without being skeptical. You need to actually challenge government, but not, as you said, not as like the other, you know, because, you know, I mean, we have friends in government, and you create, what are the structures, the institutions, and really the thing that the founders were really concerned about was the concentration of power in various forms, and in the Citizens United's case, Justice Stevens actually goes to great length to talk about concentration of power in corporations, and not addressed in the Constitution because corporations at the time weren't separate from government. They were expression of government. But the point is that, yes, we can have abuse, and we do have abuse, and we have to be careful in terms of giving government or anyone. But as we saw with a lot of the invasions of privacy, government went to Google and Apple to get all the information they needed to actually trample people's civil liberties. And I'm not saying that we should break them up, but I think the context has changed. And I think the world movement in terms of really illegal governments, illiberal governments, taking extreme, and just to be careful in terms of, even as we're critical, making government accountable and creating checks and balance, not to actually buy into the notion that government necessarily is bad and can't do anything, which I think erodes our public schools, erodes our public institutions, it ultimately erodes democracy itself. So that's the only codicil I would add.
That's very helpful, and I'll bear it in mind, because I completely agree with John. And one of the phrases that is often used about our Constitution is a delicate balance. And I find myself lately, for a long time now actually, whenever I say something that's critical of media, I immediately back up and say, but that is not the same as saying the media is the enemy of the people. So from now on, John, with attribution to you, I'm going to say a healthy, I like the word skepticism still, so we can agree to disagree about that. A healthy skepticism is positive. But we should definitely recognize, as the ACLU has always distinguished itself from our libertarian friends by lobbying for example, civil rights laws. And when we get to corporate power, this is a very important topic with so much power over free speech or lack of free speech, privacy, lack of privacy, residing in the hands of private sector entities who are subject to virtually no regulatory constraint in this area. To me, it's like the lesser of two evils. Of whom am I more skeptical? And I will quote a colleague at the Electronic Frontier Foundation who put it very well when she said, you know, do I distrust more Big Brother, the government, or the bros of Silicon Valley to exercise these powers? I hope that we can turn to what we think is effective and what can work. John, we heard an example last night from Christian Picciolini, and I have followed with great interest and being very moved the efforts of countless generous, compassionate, empathetic people who both online and in the rest of the world reach out to even confirmed leaders of hate-monger organizations and have been able to do what they call redeem them. They use somewhat religious language. Many of them are deeply spiritual people. And it's been very eye-opening to me because I think as a lawyer, I was more used to thinking of counter speech and a wholesale basis. You engage in debates and, you know, refutations. And the more I got into this, the more I thought, no, that is not a constructive way to certainly to win over an individual who is already leaning in that direction. And perhaps for the society as a whole, we have to have a much more forgiving approach. It becomes harder in a society where, with all of the polarization, if you are not sufficiently condemnatory of somebody who is saying something wrong, then you run a danger of being accused of being, as one of my friends says, some kind of an ist or an obe. So I was really so heartened by all of your wonderful work, John, of talking about getting beyond hate, not only in the way that we usually refer to it in terms of who you are, but also in terms of what you believe, what you think. And I agree with you, we're too quick to condemn as hateful speech, as hateful people whose ideas we disagree with. I'm going to give one other example because Southern Poverty Law Center has also been in the news today and yesterday. I'm very supportive of its fabulous work in countering racist violence, including the Ku Klux Klan. But I recently came to the defense of an organization called the Alliance Defense Fund, which is almost always against the ACLU on critically important cases. It even wrote a whole book called The ACLU Against America, because they saw us in crusading for LGBT rights and reproductive freedom and rights in the criminal justice system and separation of church and state as being somehow unpatriotic. We happen to agree on many free speech issues, but most recently we were in the Supreme Court directly representing the parties on opposite sides of the famous cake case from Colorado. The ACLU directly represented the same-sex couple who were denied a cake to celebrate their marriage, and ADF directly represented the devout Christian baker who refused to provide that. And so I strongly disagree with ADF's views, but I do not think it was fair to, or helpful or constructive, to lump it together with the KKK and violent white supremacists as a hate group.
So I think I completely agree. And we're having a conference. Many of you probably won't come, but you're invited, from April 8th to 10th on othering and belonging. I'll say that again because it's sort of a wonky phrase. Othering and belonging. And one of the things we talk about is building bridges. And so at the conference, we're going to have Desmond Need and Neil, I don't forget Neil's last name, but they're two of the organizers in Florida who actually worked on the Florida restoration. And both of them are returning citizens, spent time in prison. Desmond is urban African-American, and Neil is white, rural. Desmond has very liberal politics. Neil is a Trump supporter. And they've built a bridge. And so we talk about bridging, how important it is to bridge with those who have some different views than you. And one example for me, and people are very confused by it, is I become good friends with Arthur Brooks, who's head of American Enterprise Institute, which is one of the larger conservative organizations. And I feel like we disagree a lot in terms of how to do something, but our end goals are actually quite close. We both care about things, and we disagree as to how do you get there. But more importantly, in some ways, he's a very decent person, a very loving person. He's an empiricist. So like you, like us, he's saying, this is what I believe, but if you show me evidence that this really doesn't work, I'm willing to consider it. So he's not an ideologue. He has ideas. He sometimes say, our friendship has made him a better person, but a worse conservative. Because he says when he thinks of something now, he always thinks, how would John respond to this? Because it's easier to hate in some ways in the abstract than the person really in front of you. And so I agree with you that we have to find, unfortunately, we live in very segregated worlds, so we don't have the quote unquote, the other in front of us anymore. So I see our time is up, so I'm going to stop.
I didn't even see it.
Questions? Are the students with the microphones, are you in here? Okay, great. So if people who are interested in asking questions just want to raise your hand, there's 2 students who will be coming around with microphones.
I didn't even notice. I would have just gone on.
Hello. Thank you for coming out. That was a great discussion. Let me just say, first of all, I'm encouraged to hear civil libertarians talking about the psychological side, right, and the psychological evidence. I wonder how, you talked a bit about the detrimental impact of certain speech on certain populations. I wonder how you react to the Jonathan Haidt, Greg Lukianoff thesis that it kind of argues the other, I guess, psychological side, and that is that the increase in anxiety we see among the youngest generation might have something to do with sort of a focus on safety to the point that there isn't students or young people aren't learning resilience. They're not learning the ability to engage constructively in counter speech, and instead living in bubbles, and as a result there's heightened fear and anxiety. I wonder if you've thought about that perspective as well.
Well, I certainly have. I'm an admirer of their work. I blurbed the book, I quote it, and more importantly, the psychologists that they cite. And I agree with John that there seems to be debate among those who study these things from a scientific perspective. A, what exactly is the impact, but B, what intervention is going to be constructive. So I think the fact that that is out there on the table, and even the social psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett, who was highly critical of their, especially John, because he's the social psychologist, right, of the thesis when it was first put out in Atlantic Magazine, she drew a distinction between single individual episodes of hateful speech versus a sustained, ongoing, pervasive climate. And so, the jury is out both on the degree and nature of the harm, but also even more constructively, what is the most effective way to prevent the harm? Whenever I make that point, which I do you mind telling me your name?
I'm Wayne Batches. I'm a professor here at
Very nice to meet you. Whenever I make that point, I always say I'm not blaming the victim, because I think it sounds a little bit, that rhetoric to me raises that potential specter that, if you're allowing it to hurt you, if you're not resilient enough, it's your fault. But what I do find encouraging is the notion that, we might even be able to develop cognitive behavior and other techniques that might prevent that physiological impact. I would at least be open to hoping that could be shown.
So there's even a concept of positive trauma, but it's so you can Google it. So not all trauma is necessarily bad. So
this is just a question about Professor Strassen's suggestion. I like the idea of counter speech as the appropriate response, but in the context of the university, I'm a little concerned when you suggest that it's appropriate for, say, university presidents to either condemn or rebut or even make much of a contestation when their faculty make controversial statements. Because you get into that practice, you have what you recently had at Temple, right, where faculty member makes a statement and then it's deemed anti-Semitic to criticize Israel, and then you're going to expect the president to be constantly issuing denunciations of any statement that offends any group. So I'm a fan of the counter speech, but to me it doesn't seem like it should be coming from the administration.
It's a very difficult question, and I kind of self-censored myself as I was making that point, because I recognize many layers of complexity, starting with something I alluded to when I was talking about the high school students, that if we have so much counter speech and we anticipate so much counter speech, it's really going to exercise too much of a censorious chilling impact, even on discussion of, especially on discussion of sensitive and important issues such as race and religion and gender. My colleague Suzanne Nussel, who is the executive director of PEN USA, which does wonderful work in this area, had an excellent op-ed on point last year in the Washington Post, whose headline was kind of startling given that I'm so strongly advocating counterspeech, but I agreed with her point. It was, when does counterspeech go too far? And to me, it's a delicate judgment that you have to make in any particular situation. But number one, if it is done, and I on balance do think it should be done, but it has to be done very carefully so that the university president is making it clear that there is no punishment at all, that academic freedom is protected, free speech is protected. But I've also become increasingly concerned about what is the most, so that's, I was advocating that kind of statement to offer support to the people who are disparaged. But now I've become more encouraged about potentially persuading and reaching out to those who make the disparaging comment. And I think that denouncing their message is probably not the most effective way to persuade them to rethink it.
I think that's right, although I think it is complicated, right? Because on one hand, we're saying we want a robust space for speech. And then if there's robust counter speech, we're saying that counter speech may be injurious. Well, we can't have it both ways. We can't say that speech is not injurious, but counter speech is injurious. So recognizing that, yes, and you're also really, what you didn't say, but implicit in what you said is power. That there is a power differential, including the power to act. But that's oftentimes the case throughout speech. And so I think it is complicated. And part of that is just, being a good administrator or whatever. You don't necessarily want the government coming in and saying, university presidents can't say that. But it does speak to, I think, to the layers and complexity of speech and power, which we haven't really talked much about power other than the government.
One really good example of how this was done brilliantly, I think, is the University of Florida president, who, interestingly enough, is a minister, as well as having a PhD in some scientific field. And I hadn't realized that your father was a minister too, John. And he actually, when Richard Spencer was going to come to his campus, he really diffused the anxiety as well as the potential disruption, but reaching out in a way that was affirming the positive values even more than condemning the negative ones. He dared to use the L word, love, and it didn't come across as corny. It was really embraced wholeheartedly by the student body.
Yeah.
Hi. Could I ask you to talk a little bit about power in relation to free speech and preventing speech?
Do you want to, sir?
The question of power also, it's a sort of flip side of power, if you will, is it's really, Nadine actually touched on it, but I want to go a little more deeply in terms of participation. How do you effectively participate? In some ways, one of the things that speech is about is participation. And when I went to law school, which was long before these students were born, but there was the notion of political speech, commercial speech, and they deserved different forms of protection. And part of it was both the purpose of speech, and also part of it was power. In a sense, we've sort of bleached power out of the discussion. I think we have to bring it back. Because we sort of skirted around it. When you think about when women start coming into the workplace, and when they first start coming into the workplace, oftentimes there were pornographic pictures all around the workplace. And the first response was not to take down the pictures. The first response was counter speech. But the women didn't have the power to effectively counter speech. I mean, and literally people said stuff like, well, if you don't like our posters, put up your own posters. We put up nude women, you can put up nude men. So power sometimes means there is no effective counter speech because the power differential is at play in a serious way. And oftentimes we don't discuss that. And it's interesting that the Supreme Court agreed, basically in terms of the idea of hostile work environment came from conservatives, Republicans on the Supreme Court, recognizing that women in that situation didn't have the power. And they sort of kicked it upstairs to management, saying you have to actually control the workforce environment so that it's not a hostile environment. Now it's interesting, in the next iteration of that, when it came to blacks and people of color coming to the workplace, the court didn't immediately actually see the analogy. It had to go through the whole process all over again. And the ACLU had to go through the whole process all over again, but eventually came out the same way. But again, sort of recognizing that power matters. And so the ability to actually engage in counter speech actually is always affected by a huge power differential. Now, when you're talking about students talking to students or someone who's coming on campus, and then they're gone, the power is not as significant as you have an administrator who says, you have free speech, but you know what, your raise, your promotion, there's so many variables that don't know, and maybe even not even intentionally, maybe unconsciously, that sticks in the back of my mind, and I just don't think you should be full professor after that speech. So the power stuff is real, and it's complicated.
Yeah, and I had forgotten until I went back and reread those early articles by Chuck Lawrence and the others, that they took a very contextual approach to deciding whether any particular word, even the most odious racist epithet, they said shouldn't necessarily be considered hate speech, that you would have to consider every fact and circumstance, including the power relationship or lack of power relationship between the speakers. One thing that's potentially wonderful about the internet and social media, and we can all think of examples where it has had that potential benefit, is that it has increased the power of people who are not wealthy, who are not celebrities, who are not particularly experienced. And I'm very thrilled at the extent to which young people with their superior knowledge and experience with social media have really had a big impact in raising their voices. Today, right, there's a worldwide movement among students to and raise their voices through social media on environmental issues. We saw it on gun issues recently. On the other hand, the downside of that is the power of the mob online to punish people for having wrong-headed thoughts or saying something wrong. So, these are all media, and we people, we individuals, we human beings can use it along with every other tool for good or ill.
On the related topic, actually, I'm fascinated by the conversation at the individual level, right, about individual rights and impinging on individual level freedom. What complicates things for me as a media scholar is when they're sort of peddling in this kind of hateful discourse. So when you have tech platforms and tech companies who are benefiting financially from serving as a mechanism for the dissemination of hate, when you have cable outlets that actively capitalize and profit on this kind of stuff, or you have talk radio hosts, I'm just trying to figure out how do you fit that in the framework of this conversation when there is a financial and sort of status reward.
Yeah, well, studies do seem to show that it's the more hateful, provocative, extremist statements that get the eyeballs, and that's where the money is. And I think it's so positive that we are seeing all of these dangers and that they're being talked about very concertedly in the last 2 years. There are many creative conversations and explorations of what would be an appropriate intervention. Elizabeth Warren and some of the other presidential candidates are advocating, but I've heard this from Republican conservatives as well, advocating at least looking into some kind of antitrust or anti-competitive remedy, so you wouldn't be directly suppressing their messages, but at least you would be creating an opportunity for more diverse options. And that brings me to the power that all of us, we really do have potential power. I don't think it's been sufficiently harnessed yet as consumers, right? Because ultimately, these are businesses. They're concerned about the bottom line. If we can convince them that their products are disserving us, or we no longer want to be their products, then we have to raise our economic power as well as our free speech critical power.
Hi. Earlier you had said that the ACLU had tried implementing and giving suggestions to make universities safer, and I was wondering what were some of those suggestions?
The question was specifically about full inclusion of individuals and groups who had traditionally been excluded and marginalized. And it's a long list. Off the top of my head, number one, which we can't really take for granted anymore, unfortunately, if we ever could, and that is absolutely protecting the physical safety of students, and that's become a more pressing, dominant concern in the recent past, as we've seen so much evidence about sexual assaults and sexual violence on campus, which too often has not been treated seriously. So that's one very important one. And providing support, psychological and emotional and educational support for students and communities who are actually victimized by hateful speech. By the way, also prosecuting or disciplining as potential hate crimes or bias crimes some assaults and vandalism on campus, where unfortunately we have too many incidents where the victims of these crimes are intentionally singled out for discriminatory reasons. So that has to be at least investigated as a potential hate crime. Affirmative action, we are strong supporters of affirmative action, which seems to be embattled at every level for hiring and for admissions in every sector of the university, for enriching the educational offerings in terms of what we used to call multicultural education. I don't know if there's a better term for that, but to make sure that there's access to information and ideas about all cultures and peoples, to make sure that all of us are educators and administrators and staff people, as well as students, are educated in ways that we can effectively communicate and address these difficult issues. So those are the most important ones that come to my mind. Anything else, John?
Well, just I think universities and institutions have values, and this is actually one of the issues when I was at the ACLU. We talked about being neutral or not, and I posited that we were not neutral, we were nonpartisan, and it shouldn't be confused with neutral. That in terms of helping to give life to the Constitution is a value-laden document. And so, so two things. One is that if you're at a university or whatever, it's like for the university to express, these are our values. If you say inclusion and belonging are our values, say that, and then figure out how to operationalize it. But oftentimes the university, in terms of trying to be so fair in terms of speech, it's like, we got to be neutral. It's like, no, you don't have to be neutral. What do you stand for as a university? Say that, be clear about that, and then not just be clear about it in terms of words, but also in terms of activity. There's a concept, it's come up a lot in the affirmative action cases. Nadine mentioned affirmative action of critical mass. And if you read Claude Still's work, he wrote a book called Whistling Vivaldi. And the idea is that if a marginalized group has low numbers, they're under what he calls identity threats. And so if you're the only woman in a meeting of 50 guys, psychologically, and again, this is pretty strong science, you're distracted. You're noticed, you're performing. It's like, what do women think? I'm one woman. I literally had a student in a class just recently say to me, because we were talking about some stuff around disability, and she started crying. She said, I'm the only disabled student in the class, and I feel like I'm being targeted. It turns out that there were probably 15 to 20% of the class was disabled, but was invisible. But her point was well taken, right? Is that, so part of the thing in terms of critical mass and affirmative action is how do you have not just one black, one woman, one person with disability, which already creates a threat. And then that person is even more vulnerable in some ways. So to create an environment, Nadine writes about resiliency in her book, and I think it's a really important concept. One of the things we know about resiliency is that resiliency happens better if you're in a community, if you're in a network. It's hard to be resilient when you're by yourself or when everybody in your network is also under threat.
And John talked about this earlier about how we have to find opportunities to interact with people that we otherwise, no pun intended, might be tempted to think of as other. And I read again the research for my book, the famous contact theory, which was created way back in the 40s, but has been reaffirmed over and over and over again. It's one of those social science validations of common sense that the most effective way by far to get over negative stereotypes is to actually interact with somebody in that group. And so that to me is such an essential call for affirmative action, especially when we lead such segregated, isolated lives in other ways because of deeply entrenched patterns of housing and schooling and so forth. Let us at least use those opportunities that are open at the university level and employment to effectuate the contact theory. I want to tell one story about this because I think the online media are no different in terms of their potential for good or ill than past media, but the difference is that as people are spending more and more time online, they're having less and less time with physical contact with full-fledged human beings. And this is a story I was given permission to tell. I had a breakfast meeting with former Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy and a fairly small group of people that were speaking at a conference about him. And at the end of the conversation, a man who was one of the group, and the conversation with Kennedy had been going on for more than an hour, this gentleman said, I am a Muslim American. I never felt I had to identify myself that way until very recently. He said, Justice Kennedy, I came here prepared to hate you and to denounce you. What he was referring to was Kennedy cast the tie-breaking vote in the case that upheld Trump's so-called Muslim travel ban. He said, I still completely disagree with that opinion and decision, but now that I've heard you and met you and listened to you, I can't hate you anymore, and I can't denounce the idea as being negatively motivated by hatred as I had assumed.
Our time is up. Let me take 30 seconds because so I was talking to someone about the affirmative action stuff, and as you know, there's a case at Harvard now that's probably working its way to the Supreme Court. And I would love students, and I think the ACLU, to actually bring this suit. And this would be the suit. So here's the thing. Harvard, Stanford, Berkeley, the entering class at Berkeley, the average GPA is 4.3. We could fill our entire student body with students with perfect SAT scores and with perfect grades. I think that would be a mistake. For a whole bunch of reasons. I mean, we know that diversity really does matter. But beyond that, what we're really saying is we've created this false scarcity. And the student that doesn't have a 4.3, that only has a 3.9, who didn't get a perfect score, got one question wrong on the SAT scores, is more than capable of doing the work. So why isn't someone suing to challenge states, especially, for creating this false scarcity? We say education is extremely important. These students are well qualified, and we say we have 10 slots, and we have 100 students who are capable. So we have to have some way of sorting, to get rid of 90 of you who are more than capable because we only have 10 slots. And it's like, why do we only have 10 slots? Why do we only have 10 slots when we have more than 100 students who are capable of doing the work? Why isn't someone challenging the state for that? It seems like we are really missing the ball. Instead, we sort of fight over each other. Who's in that 10 and who's out of that 10?
And the high school students here have standing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.